Welcome back to this Insight Special as we review the past 12 months in news. Before the break, we were talking about the civil war in Syria. Now let's move to Iraq and the fight to defeat Daesh. TRT World's Nicole Johnson was following Iraqi forces as they made their way into Mosul.
Despite the danger they'll face, people are leaving, walking for over an hour through open fields, shells and mortars falling around them, carrying by hand or on a donkey cart whatever they can. Who knows when they'll get home again. Arriving in shock, many too afraid to show their face on camera. Daesh killed 300 policemen?
No, not too much. Maybe I think just for my it's my air, I listen 300. Just him kill maybe 3,000. What I think.
Trucks have been organised to take people away to camps in the Kurdish-controlled region of northern Iraq. More than 1.5 million Iraqis have been displaced by Daesh in the last 3 years.
They escape hell and come to heaven. If you could see the happiness in their faces, poor people who were suffering under Daesh.
So let's talk about the situation in Iraq in 2016 with our panel. They are the economist and author Linda Yo, a political risk analyst from Africa Matters Imad Mesdoua, the associate editor of Newsweek Eliza Gray, and the broadcaster and writer Charlie Wolfe. Imad, Mosul again, I suppose. It's difficult to compress 12 months of activity in just a few days, but the retaking of that city from what, 2014, 2 years ago, when Daesh forces went in there, was quite symbolic this year.
Yes, and I think actually there's a battle of attrition that's going to happen there also. Daesh is far from defeated in Iraq and in Syria. And I think we need to look beyond the simple and simplistic military victories and try to understand how many of these fighters are actually either going to melt into local populations or disperse into new regions. You know, they look for safe havens, unstable territories in order for them to operate, to get new recruits, to get their weapons, supply chains, etc. So Mosul in itself is not the be-all and end-all of how we defeat Daesh, but it would be an important victory. And I think it's going to be one of the most important things to look out for in the early days of the Trump administration.
I feel I haven't heard the story of regular Iraqis. I mean, wherever you live in Iraq, be it in Baghdad, be it in Mosul, what's life been like in 2016? Presumably, most people are managing to struggle a living somehow. They're finding enough food and water to live by.
Well, certainly not in Mosul. In Mosul, we are dealing with a very similar scenario to Aleppo because it is, in effect, a siege. You have an American-led coalition that is supporting Iraqi troops in bombing Daesh forces, but it's a very difficult humanitarian situation. You have thousands of people that have been displaced. Basic infrastructure is not running, obviously. And so actually, it is a very, very difficult humanitarian situation, which unfortunately didn't get the same media attention globally as Aleppo because it just happened to be for a more prolonged period. And obviously, all attention turns towards Aleppo. But the situation is absolutely horrific there.
It seems to be one of those things, Charlie Wolfe, the world can only deal with one real crisis at any one time. Do you think Iraq has been unfairly ignored this year?
Probably. They just, how the press finds their sympathy story, if I can call it that, of the moment, I don't know. I mean, we had the baby, the little boy on the beach, who again, not to dismiss the tragedy of it all, was not a refugee, as I understand, was actually an economic immigrant, but it was a picture and it was something that made it to the front of magazines all over the world and newspapers all over the world. And, you know, the public, I think it's a basic economic theory, isn't it, that the public are not really rational in their choices of either news or products or what have you. So what the answer is, well, I'd be making a lot more money, you know, and I'd be sitting in the White House if I knew that.
But you kind of have to find the human angle, I suppose, Eliza, for all of us, not just maybe journalists trying to tell a story or to sell a newspaper or a television program, but in this incomprehensible mess, we find something to try and make sense of it or to feel something about it, don't we?
Yeah, certainly. And I think because of so many refugees were coming out of Syria this year, I think people were particularly focused on what was going on there. And I also think Iraq feels like, even though it isn't, I think it feels like an old story to people because the conflict there has been going on for so long. And we did see a lot of images of people fleeing Syria this year, and I think that did touch people. I also think when you hear of mass tragedy, it can be very hard to actually take that
Relate that.
But
Relate to
whereas
that,
you see one child, then you can think about your neighbor child or your own child, and I think that makes it easier for people to comprehend these events.
Linda, on the big picture, which is suppose is Daesh needs to be defeated. We've heard that from politicians in the West all the time. Do you think they've made some strides to that aim during the last year?
I think the Battle of Mosul, launched just in October, was a step in that direction. But as we've already been talking about, I think it's one of those very difficult, it's going to be very difficult to extinguish Daesh. We should never underplay that. One battle for one city isn't going to do it. But I think the international coalition coalescing behind this notion that we have to defeat terrorism wherever it is and take it to Iraq is important, it's symbolic, and if this can continue under the Trump administration and if European nations and Middle Eastern nations continue to be willing to commit resources towards it, then I think we do stand a chance of making sure that there's a concerted effort to defeat Daesh and the terrorism that they represent.
Do you think they are closer or further away, Imad, for Daesh of having their caliphate, a territory, a defined space, which is absolutely theirs?
Well, I think that the coalition-led effort has actually diminished that possibility quite significantly. But again, the battle isn't so much in making sure they don't have just a territory where they can do something close to governing or what they consider governing. The real goal is extinguishing the ideology and making sure that it is unable to wreak the kind of havoc that it does. And as we've seen with the attacks in Europe, part of the problem with Daesh now is that it's a kind of franchise that any loner, any group of...
Random groups of people can latch onto, right?
Any kind of group of people that feels angry, whatever, or attracted by that ideology, looking for answers, they can carry out damage and link themselves to that ideology and that brand. So the real battle goes beyond it. I think it's about bringing political stability in areas where these groups want to thrive, which is unstable areas. It's also about creating a kind of counter-narrative also against this kind of ideology that is all-pervasive and that is managing to attract people who are marginalized in all kinds of ways across the world.
Imad, thank you for the moment. Well, let's talk about the consequences of that. The battle against Daesh raged on in Iraq, but terror attacks occurred in Europe and beyond. They were another grim theme of this last year. In March, 3 suicide bombers targeted Brussels. 2 detonated their explosives in the airport, and 1 at a nearby metro station. More than 30 people were killed and hundreds injured. In Nice, we saw that the weapon of choice could be something as everyday as a delivery truck. The 19-ton vehicle was driven into the crowds that had turned out to celebrate Bastille Day. 86 people died in that attack. And in the summer, Munich was added to the list of cities that suffered under the banner of extremist attacks. 9 people were killed and more than 15 wounded after an 18-year-old opened fire at a shopping centre. And on December the 19th, Berlin suffered an attack which echoed that of Nice. The attacker drove a truck into a crowded Christmas market, killing more than 10 people and injuring many more. Well, let's ask our panel about this. The whole idea of this terrorist activity, Linda, is to terrorize. Do you think the European people are terrorized or fearful as a result of this catalogue of incidents?
This latest incident in Berlin, which happened in December, was amidst a Christmas market. And the many, many Christmas markets that take place across Germany and the people who attended them, I think, is a sign that Europeans won't allow terrorism to change the way that they live. So this latest tragedy is absolutely horrific. And no amount of security measures, it seems, can entirely prevent these kinds of terrorism acts. But what we did see was the German people had gone out to celebrate their traditional Christmas market with their mulled wine and their sweets, much as the people in Nice in France had gone to celebrate Bastille Day. And I can only hope that in 2017 we continue with this kind of resilience.
Eliza, do you see that? That despite the horror of that moment, life does go on?
I think that's a really a wonderful sentiment. I have to say that I think one thing that is particularly unsettling about the terrorist attacks we've seen in the last year is how easy they've been to carry out. They're small attacks with small numbers of casualties, but they can be done using a truck or a gun or a very easily created bomb, which is sort of different from the terrorism threat that I think we'd become used to prior to this year, which was well-coordinated mass attacks, which had their own kind of fear, but also felt like freak accidents in a way that these attacks don't. They feel to me a little bit more ever-present and a little bit more difficult to imagine how you could stop them, and I think that's distressing.
Charlie, we have to praise the security services, don't we, in the sense that they tell us, they don't tell us everything, of course, but France, in Germany, in the UK, security services, police forces will tell us they have actually deflected attacks. They've stopped attacks. The intel is working.
Oh, yeah. If you look back even the days of the IRA and the Troubles, as the saying went, the security services had to get it right all the time, whereas the IRA only had to get it right once. And in some respects, that was Osama bin Laden's big mess up. That was a bad strategy. 9/11 was this spectacular, if I can use the word, worldwide coverage, 3,000 dead. But what he didn't do is, and a lot of security people were surprised by this, it would have been more effective to follow that up with a death by 1,000 cuts, taking out a little fast food restaurant in Des Moines, followed by Salt Lake City, followed by whatever. And as I think Linda was saying it, and the other panelists, you can do it with a truck. You don't need well-coordinated efforts with lots of guns and rifles and what have you. Just rent a truck and go into a pile of people.
Do you think we're going to have to live with this, Imad, as we go into the next year in 2017, that incidents like this, which take a dozen or more lives, will just become, regrettably, quite regular?
Unfortunately, yes. And as was being said previously, there is no surefire way of making sure it doesn't happen. Intelligence agencies are stretched as it is in trying to counter the threat. But I think the modus operandi here is such that it becomes easily replicable for anyone, as I mentioned. The lone wolf methodology is going to continue for some time, and unfortunately, there is no, you don't need great financial means, you don't need a lot of training or coordination, but all you need is the bad sentiment, the cruelty, the evil. And there are unfortunately people throughout European societies and around the world that are capable of doing this. So there is unfortunately no way of countering it, but what we can't do is let fear dictate how we live our everyday lives, and certainly we cannot let fear also enter the political narrative, because then they also win when it becomes mainstream.
Except that there used to be an expectation that politicians were down to sort this out. I mean, at one time, Linda, we used to discuss the Israel-Palestine issue as a way of fomenting discontent. Now we've got the Daesh issue. Now we've maybe got legacy from Afghanistan and the interventions there. Do these big pan-global issues actually motivate the terrorist anymore? Or, as Imad was saying, are these just freelancers with a grievance?
I think it's probably more likely the latter. I think ideology now plays a much greater role, and I think in general we've seen that across politics. We've talked already in this program about anti-establishment sentiment. We talked about anti-migration sentiment, and I think in many ways ideology around what Daesh has been propagating, I think that is something which is quite different than the geopolitical debates of the past, which was around big definitions of the state, about historical tug of wars over territory. I think these days it is much more about what they think those who believe in Daesh think their ideology represents.
Yeah, and one of the key things about Daesh, which distinguishes it from its predecessors, I guess, in jihadi terrorism, is actually its ability to communicate across social and territorial lines. Yeah. Its propaganda machine is able to generate the kinds of images that can attract the loners that you were mentioning from around the world. The fact that they're able to get a young person from Paris, a young person from Brussels, a young person from London to travel all the way. It's by using images from Syria, it's by using images from Iraq, by using this ideology that the Ummah, the Islamic community, is under attack, that people are suffering and that there is a greater cause for these loners. That ability has unfortunately not been checked sufficiently, I think, by political establishments across the West.
Imad, thank you very much for the moment. Now, finally, if anything else defined 2016, it was the loss of a huge number of names from the world of arts, music and culture. Here's a brief reminder of just a few. Well, let's turn to my panel. Eliza, I think you met Muhammad Ali.
Yes, I did. In 1995, when I was actually quite young, I was only 10 at the time, Muhammad Ali came to an opening in Washington, D.C. of Harry Bingham photographs of him, who actually unfortunately died also a few days ago. And what I do remember most about that meeting was this sense that a lot of people describe about meeting him in those years. He had Parkinson's, unfortunately, but he had this kind of almost mystical religious feeling about him. It was sort of like meeting the Dalai Lama or the Pope. You know, you just sort of felt like you were in the presence of something really sort of special and magical. So he was certainly, we've been talking about establishment on this panel today, and in all the most positive ways, I think Muhammad Ali represented anti-establishment during his life, and it's good to remember him.
Charlie, people pass away, of course, all the time, every day, every year. It does feel like this last calendar year, though, we've lost a lot of really talented souls. I mean, the Bowies of this world, Leonard Cohen's world. And music, of course, stays with you through your life, doesn't it, really?
And unexpectedly, in the case of Bowie and Prince, you know, David Bowie had somehow kept this cancer that he had, I think, hidden from the world. And suddenly, he's able to script and make an album about his own death. So you're watching him in a video the day after the Lazarus video. That was kind of different. You don't see that every day. No one expected Prince to die of, you know, of drugs. So those two in particular, major figures on the music stage. Gene Wilder, you know, just a nice guy. So, you know, Zsa Zsa Gabor, someone I grew up with, you know, watching on the Carson show and things like that, you know, at 99. So it's something about the end of the year especially that I always find surprising. It's like, I don't know why, it just seems like this week between Christmas and New Year, more people seem to die in this, famous people seem to die in this one week. I don't know why. And also, if you read the papers, I don't know how it is, but they all die in alphabetical order as well, so.
Yeah, I think that's something to do with the newspapers. It is. But it may be as a counterpoint to the rest and more grim side of our lives, which we've discussed earlier in the program, Linda. That's why we treasure these musical memories, don't we? Or you had to be there, a certain moment and a certain song chimes with it.
Very much so. I think it's the shared culture that's really poignant about it when talented musicians, talented artists pass away, because we all shared that music. We remember that joint memory. And I actually think in a world where we increasingly have division, it's very important to remember what it is that we do share. And I think culture plays a huge role in that. But just coming back to the question that you had posed before about why this year, I did actually look at this. There were a couple of articles about this, looking at why it is that 2016 seemed to have a disproportionate share of celebrities passing away. And it has something to do, apparently, with the baby boomers. And so as the baby boomers hit that as I get older, I am not keen on this theory at all. But as you
Come on, you better
diminish in order,
explain.
as you sort of pass your prime, the baby boomers, in a sense, are in that kind of territory where they could pass away due to natural causes, due to cancer, or due to other things. And so actually it's demographics would explain part of it. But I think this is probably a reflection of the generation we are all in, that,
Yes.
that we might notice that.
Well, thank you for putting me in the same generation as you guys. It's very generous. It is those moments, I suppose, you relate to a certain thing perhaps in your youth, and then when the person, the artist who created that moment or that musical memory passes on, you do feel it.
Well, for me, it's definitely Muhammad Ali. You know, growing up, he was articulate, he was elegant. I could relate to him because he was Muslim. And some of his fights are absolutely legendary. He made me like a sport that I didn't like, which was boxing. And I just remember that, you know, I grew up in Algeria, I'm from Algeria, and people there it was incredible that people with such a different culture and such a different background could relate to this man who was from America, so far away. But because of his grace, because of the elegance, because of the way he spoke, and his, you know, he was heroic also, you know, on a ring. He inspired so many, and particularly, I think, in the Muslim world, we really looked up to him.
Particularly, I mean, his whole persona was a sort of arrogance, wasn't it? I am the greatest. I mean, it takes some gumption to be able to say that. And of course, he actually be able to deliver on that until he couldn't anymore. But even post-boxing, he was an engaging individual, wasn't he? To put it mildly.
Yeah, and everybody that met him will tell you that despite the illness that debilitated him, he still kept a kind of charisma, humor about it, a savoir-vivre, which inspired, again, so many people. And he truly was an iconic figure on and off the ring, and I think he'll forever be remembered as one of the great athletes in human history.
Well, let's grasp that happy moment of sweet memories, shall we, to which to conclude our programme. Linda, Imad, Eliza, Charlie, thank you all very much for being with us, and a Happy New Year to you all. That's all for this special edition of Insight, looking back at 2016. We will be here throughout the next 12 months to bring you the story behind the headlines and help you make sense of your world. I'm Martin Stanford. That was Insight.